Hello everyone, it's Miss Seichter. I will be showing you how to create a Zentangle watercolor portrait. Step number 1 of this project is to take a picture of yourself and print it off. Since my 8.5 by 11 paper is much smaller than the watercolor paper that I will be transferring it onto, I need to make sure that my face takes up as much room in my picture plane as possible. When you do that, you also have to be careful of any cropping that might happen. For example, my shoulder goes off the side of the paper right here. So that means later on I will have to do some decision making. Will I make up what I think the rest of my shoulder should look like and continue my image? Or do I move it along the side of my watercolor paper so that the left side of my watercolor paper lines up with the left side of my image? After printing off that picture, you need to evaluate if it's in black and white or in color, because when you trace your self-portrait onto your watercolor paper, working in black and white can be a little bit difficult because there are some areas, like in the left-hand side right here, where I can't really tell what's going on behind the tracing paper. It covers it up a little too much. While as with color, I can see a little bit more of a difference. There is a way to work around this though. A way that you can trace this easier is either some kind of tracing table or light table. Most people don't have those handy, so a good shortcut on that is to tape this up against a window during daytime so that the light is showing through your paper, and it will kind of aid in the tracing process. So I'm going to be using my colored picture. In tracing, you're going to want to use a wooden pencil, not a mechanical pencil, because these work a lot better for this job. You're going to want to press pretty hard with this pencil and make sure that whatever lines you trace are pretty thick. Otherwise, the tracing process later on doesn't work very well. Another thing you might want to keep in mind when tracing is you may want to include some kind of implied line. That means it's a line where your line stops. It gets so thin that it becomes invisible, it stops, and then it continues on in another area. That happens in areas in your face, for example, like the line that I know connects my nose to the side of my mouth. That would be an excellent area for me to incorporate an implied line, or another word for this is a phantom line, where it gets thin, it goes invisible, my eye kind of fills in where the line should be, and then it continues on the other side. So now that my image has been traced, I'm ready to transfer this onto my watercolor paper. The reason why I am tracing this instead of drawing directly on the watercolor paper is because oftentimes watercolor paper can be pretty unforgiving when it comes to mistakes. If you make a mistake with pencil and you try to erase it, those things show up very, very easily and very noticeably on watercolor paper. This way around, any mistakes I may have made is on another piece of paper, in this case tracing paper. And in order for this to work, I need to make sure that it is graphite side down. The graphite side has to be on the watercolor paper or whatever surface I am tracing it on. And I need to decide whether I want this off to the side so that my shoulder is cropped off by the side of the paper, or if I want to make it up and fill it in as I think it should be going. And I'm going to use my pencil again, and I'm going to press on it from the back side of the tracing paper and just trace the back of the tracing paper. I want to press pretty hard. I don't want to press so hard that my hand hurts, but I do want to press hard in terms of being sure that this transfers correctly, because how this works is the graphite that is on the other side of the tracing paper is being pressed into the surface of the watercolor paper by my pencil on the opposite side. So now that my image has been traced on this side, therefore pressing the graphite on the other side into my watercolor paper, my image should have transferred very lightly. And I still have to finish off part of my design so that I have an arm. So in order for Zentangles to fill up my design, I need to separate it into several different sections. So I'm going to do that in my hair for sure, because that's part of the project. And I want to do, personally, I'm going to go for at least 6 designs would be a good call. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I have all this empty background space as well to fill up, so I'm going to have to separate that into sections as well. And they can be any kind of swirly lines, they could be more geometric straight lines, they could be outlines of representational things, or they could stay abstract. Now's the time for me to outline everything in Sharpie. So I don't want to use thin Sharpie for this. This is really more for the fine details within my actual Zentangle patterns. I'm going to want to use a thicker Sharpie for this. And with thick Sharpies, I don't want to press down with a lot of force on the pointy tip of this, because over time it will flatten, and therefore I will be able to do less things with this Sharpie. So I'm going to hold it more to the side if I want a thick line, and hold it more on the tip if I want a thin line. And if I want it to be even thinner, I can switch to this one. But I don't want to apply much pressure, because if I do, it will be hard on my Sharpies. So now that my image has been outlined with Sharpie, I need to start filling up all of those different sections with different kinds of Zentangles. I can make up my own Zentangles by figuring out how I can use line to create repetition or rhythm. So repetition will happen if I repeat that line, but rhythm will help move your eye across the piece. Not unlike how music kind of has its own rhythm. So think about what kind of repetitive line you can use. Maybe you want to do straight, maybe you want to do curvy, maybe you want to do zigzag. But also, in addition to figuring out what kind of line you want to do, think about the line direction. Are you going to do vertical lines? Are you going to do repetitive horizontal lines? Are your lines going to be more vertical? Once you figure that out, you can kind of make it up as you go, add different kinds of shapes until you have a unique kind of pattern in each of these different sections. If you want to try some with your own made up Zentangles, you could also look up some existing Zentangles too. There's a lot out there in the internet. So you can go onto YouTube, you can go onto several websites. I know they have several books with existing Zentangles, and they'll take you step by step on how to create those already existing Zentangles. And one thing about how they do Zentangles is they don't go in with pencil first, because they don't really fear making mistakes. The creators of Zentangle want you to go right into it with kind of a doodle mentality. Kind of like when you're on the phone and you start doodling, you might not necessarily care about making all those little mistakes. This is not unlike that. So going in with a pen or a Sharpie, you want to kind of let go of your fear of making mistakes and just kind of make it up as you go. Any kind of mistakes you can kind of mask with further patterns or further Zentangles. So I've taped down the border of my watercolor paper, just so that it prevents the wet paper from buckling or warping or wrinkling while I'm painting on it. That causes some areas to have the watercolor pool and make those areas look darker. So this is an optional step, but it makes things a lot easier for you. It also means that since my drawing underneath that tape continues, the tape prevents the watercolor from coloring those areas. So the Sharpie drawing will continue all the way out to the border, but there's going to be the thinnest sliver where the watercolor does not. And that's okay, because for the most part, your artwork will probably be covered with some kind of mat board or a mat border, so that thin sliver will be covered up anyway. So I have my watercolor palette, I have my water, and I have my paint brushes. You're going to want a variety of different sizes. I have a large one for some of the bigger areas and a small one for some of the smaller areas. It would be a mistake to use a bigger paintbrush in some of these smaller, delicate, detailed areas because I might paint outside the lines. It would be a mistake to use a really tiny paintbrush in these big areas because I will continuously be going back to my color to fill that up, and I'm going to create an uneven layer. When painting, I'm going to want to create a puddle with my watercolors. I create a puddle by getting my paintbrush wet with water and scrubbing at whatever watercolor I have on my palette. It wakens up the paints, and then making my puddle in an open area, maybe on the lid, somewhere off to the side of my palette. And I can go right in and paint over what I want to, but keep in mind pressure is important. If I press really lightly, my paintbrush is going to maintain a very fine pointed tip, which is good for outer edges. And I start on one side of my area and I move systematically over so that the water kind of flows with my brush systematically. It makes it so it all dries relatively evenly. So I'm going to press really lightly for the boundary areas or any areas that are very small, but in the inside areas I'm going to press a little harder and it'll splay my bristles out wider and cover a wider area. So if I press lightly, my bristles are very pointed. If I press hard, they will widen out. And my water only goes so far before I need to go back to my puddle I made over here and continue painting. So my brush acts kind of like a sponge. I get it back into that puddle to pick up or absorb some of that watercolor pigment, and then I move it back onto my paper. Again, starting in one area and moving away. There are a couple other techniques I can do. One of them is lift off. If I want highlights in some areas, I need to wash off my paintbrush, get it relatively dry, and run it over any area I want to lift off some of that pigment. And it kind of does what a sponge would do to a dirty table, and it lifts up some of that pigment so that I can create a highlight. So blending from dark to light might be a good idea in some areas. Another thing you could do to blend from dark to light is to get the paper wet ahead of time. And if I want to make some areas darker, because I did my first layer and I want to make it look like there are maybe some shadows, is to wait for the first layer to dry enough and then go back in and add a second layer in some areas. And this is when sometimes I juggle between two paintbrushes. So if I want this dark brown to be even darker, a little bit of color mixing will help me. I can add some black on my paintbrush back into that brown. It makes it a little bit of a darker brown. And if I want to make some areas look darker, I go in with a layer number 2. Again, pressing lightly if I want to maintain a thin detailed area. Now this isn't really blending off all that well. I could keep my brush strokes showing, or I could go in with a clean paintbrush to kind of make that color blend off a little bit. I do that by getting my paintbrush wet and going in with my darker pigment to drop in some of that shadow so it blends itself. Now moving forward, I don't want to paint a new color that is too close or touching my wet colors. I just finished my hair, but there are still some areas that are drying. It would be a huge mistake to paint my face when the hair is still wet. Otherwise, my hair color is going to bleed into my face color, and my face color will bleed into my hair color. So do not go in and paint right next to something that is wet. That is a huge mistake that middle schoolers make. Instead, move on to another area that is not touching it. So I'm not gonna paint my face right now. I'm gonna wait for it to dry. I'm gonna move on to the background. There's a thin sliver of line that I left between myself and the background that leaves me a little bit of a border so that I can go right in and not worry about the hair color bleeding in with the rest of it. One more thing I'd like to demonstrate is a technique called wet on wet. So if I wanted to paint this area here, I could get that area wet with my paintbrush first so that it creates kind of this contained area for my watercolor pigments to flow smoothly and in a controlled way. It's going to be pretty hard to see where you've already painted. It's more important for you to paint inside the lines and really tilt your head to see if you can pick up where the light is reflecting off of that surface, but then going in and painting that area. This makes it so that your paints are a little bit more controlled. It makes it so they don't paint outside the lines very easily. It also makes it dry more evenly, and it should not blend into the neighboring areas if you were very careful about putting down that first layer of water. Now, if you accidentally paint outside the lines in an area and you need to clean that area up because maybe that's not what you intended for that area, I recommend getting your paper towel and blotting that area dry. Your paper towel should be able to lift some of that off. If that doesn't do a good enough job for you, you can get a different clean paintbrush, scrub at the surface of your watercolor paper, and it should lift it off. And moving on to a skin tone for my face, everybody's skin tones are just a little bit different. You might just be brown. You might be brown with a little bit of red in it. It might be brown with a little bit of yellow in it. For me, I'm gonna mostly start off with yellow and add a little bit of red, just a little, and a little bit of brown. And if you add too much of one color, you can always go back and add some more of the other base color that you have. And I'm going to want to go in and add some more red, maybe in my cheeks. It's helpful to look back at your picture reference see where some of the pinker areas might be. I might want to add pink on my lips, but the problem with that is the rest of my face is still wet. And if I want the pink to blend smoothly and seamlessly, I'm going to want some more of that skin color, but just add a little bit more red to it. And if my face is still wet, that should start blending on its own. And in some of the shadowy areas, I might want to go in with a little bit more brown with my natural skin color and see if I can add some shadows with just a more brown or darker version of whatever color I painted the rest of my picture with. And I'm encountering that problem I explained a little bit earlier, where two areas were wet at the same time and they're starting to bleed into each other. That's when you go in and you use a paper towel to wipe up that area so that it doesn't dry bleeded like that. So now that I'm done, I clean up my spot. I put my paintbrushes away so that they are bristle side up. These watercolor paintbrushes are very delicate, so if you store them upside down, these bristles may never go back to being the same. Here is my finished Zentangle portrait.